这样可以防止色粉沉淀，因为不添加任何化学物质，所以它比市面上的口红更安全、更健康，也更滋润，涂起来一点也不拔干。如果你也喜欢这种自然、健康的化妆品的话，那就赶紧试试看吧。我相信你一定会爱上它们的。现在就让我们一起来欣赏一下这些美丽的口红吧，看成品是不是跟买的一样。接下来我要亲自试一试这个新口红了。哇塞，这颜色真的太高级了吧！涂上去感觉整个人气色如天，赶快动手做起来吧！
都给我码住！首先准备可食用蜂蜡、橄榄油、维生素 E 和可食用色粉，然后我们开始称量蜂蜡和橄榄油。我这里用的是电子秤，可以参考我的用量，也可以自行添加。蜂蜡是10克，橄榄油是30毫升。把蜂蜡放到容器里加热融化，也可以直接隔水化开。等蜂蜡完全融化后，加入2克维 E 和5克色粉，一定要搅拌均匀，防止色粉沉底。接着可以倒入模具，先把盖子拧下来，拔出内芯。感觉没有完全冷却啊，断了。等几分钟重新来，一定要温柔一点才好。最后一步就是脱模装管了，把膏体轻轻推进管口就可以了。
Nice。
最近的。
The fakeness, if you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up. I don't ever slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up and make a statement. I don't ever slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up and make a statement. Everything I do so instinctive and so passionate. Every word I move so descriptive like an adjective. I got a vendetta against people who patented being negative when you should be getting after it. I got facts over tracks, this and that. Spitting slow, spitting fast. I could roast, I could gas. Think I'm okay at last, but I don't know if that can erase all the past. And the pettiness, a reflection of the emptiness. Hilarious, you think you're worth my time, you're delirious. Mysterious, because you hide behind a fake exterior. Inferior, you know I'll always be a bit superior. Get off of me, this ain't no humble brag. I want you to hear words, you can say them back. I want you to feel free from the chains at last, and to believe in what you got, it was built to last, yeah. Now that I've been put through hell, I never got anyone's help. I had to do it all myself. I don't ever slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up and make a statement. I don't ever slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up and make a statement. Gonna learn the consequence of being incompetent. Mental health is confidence, dreams and some honestness. I'm not here to save the day, that's for you to take away. I could play a million mind games, but instead I say something not illogical, something that is topical. Rub it on and watch it go, make yourself unstoppable. Dreams are irresponsible, but they're always possible. If you just believe, you could be so remarkable. Thoughts in my head, a collage and they spread. I'll be great one day, going off of my meds. No, I'm not giving up, no, I'm not giving in. I will make it to the top, taking off in the wind. I gotta make it, I'm saving every day to taste it. I'm patient, but my mind, it can hardly take it. I'm chasing a dream that I've had for several ages. A vacant, modern kingdom for the taking. Now that I've been put through hell, I never got anyone's help. I had to do it all myself. I don't ever slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you
可以拿去。最近得了唇炎，嘴巴干裂起皮，买了几个橘子，把它们做成唇膏试试看吧。先把橘子皮剥下来备用，然后把橘子肉吃掉，再把橘子皮剪碎，更容易出味。 加入橄榄油，盖过橘子皮即可。套上保鲜膜，上锅蒸2小时左右。最近得了唇炎，嘴巴干裂起皮，买了几个橘子，把它们做成唇膏试试看吧。先把橘子皮剥下来备用，然后把橘子肉吃掉，再把橘子皮剪碎，更容易出味。加入橄榄油，盖过橘子皮即可。套上保鲜膜，上锅蒸2小时左右。把橘子皮过滤掉，不要。再加入蜂蜡，把蜂蜡融化后，加入2颗维 E， 搅拌均匀，趁热倒入模具，冷却之后就凝固成型了。脱模看看效果怎么样。